one down. I need more time.
The mannequins will pay!
Submit! You are finished!
We are Legion! Nothing matters now. Sands! Bends to my will! Impede my enemy!
Shocking!
The mannequins will pay! For damn you! The mannequins will pay! 10,000 spears! I will grind you into dust! Forge of hate! Endless hate! Die!
Glacial Bolt has been an absolute map blaster, and all the way up to tier 15s, Glacial Bolt and Fragmentation rounds were able to carry me through no problem whatsoever. But if you're just looking for excellent clear, that's not really a good enough reason to play Glacial Bolt in my opinion. The real strength behind Glacial Bolt and Fragmentation rounds is that they benefit from freezing enemies. So you get a damage and a clear incentive to be freezing everything around you. And on top of that, the ice crystal walls created from Glacial Bolt also do hold back enemies and block pretty much all projectiles in the game, keeping you significantly safer. With all these things combined, it's a pretty comfortable mapping build. That's only real downside comes when you find very, very tight corridors. And even then, it still does fine. However, as you push into the very, very high levels of mapping content once you're in tier 15 maps, and you start getting some points into the specific boss atlas tree, boss defenses go up massively. And because of that, I had to find some tech that would allow me to still do significant damage to bosses without messing up my Glacial Bolt clear. And as everyone's starting to kind of figure out, there's only one crossbow bolt-based skill that does actually good single target, and that is going to be Shock Burst rounds. However, Shock Burst rounds has a downside in that the enemy needs to be shocked or electrocuted for it to do full damage. And with a little bit of tech, I found a way to keep a permanent shock on an enemy with Plasma Blast and Flame Wall. So with this setup, I'm able to get a permanent shock on an enemy and simply load them up with Shock Burst rounds until they fall over. Now, I've been playing this build for a little bit in Path of Exile 2, but we are in early access, so there's new tech being discovered every day. GGG is nerfing, buffing, balancing things pretty much all the time. So if you want the most up-to-date version of this guide, there's going to be a written guide down in the description from Mobilytics, and it'll always have the most detailed, up-to-date information about the build. So make sure to check that down in the description. And if this video ends up helping you out, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell so that you can stay up to date with any new videos that are coming up. Now let's talk about the build. So this build, as I said, is a Glacial Bolt Witchhunter. Now the whole idea behind Glacial Bolt is that we are trying to create these little ice crystal walls and then explode them with fragmentation rounds. And with these ice crystal walls, we're trying to scale as much AoE as possible. And if you look closely here, you'll notice that there's a large AoE that happens after you break these ice crystal walls. Now normally it takes either large enemies or a pretty significant amount of damage to break these crystal walls. However, Fragmentation rounds has a line that says, cause an explosion of shrapnel, bolts that hit an ice crystal cause it to explode. So regardless of the amount of damage that we do, we are always able to instantly one-shot these walls when we hit them. This is what caused those like cascades of damage that you saw in the preview. And on top of that with Fragmentation rounds, it also will explode explode frozen enemies in an AoE. It also does 1262% of your attack damage, which is about 20 times as much as the normal projectile when it does this explosion. So this is our bread and butter when it comes to clearing maps. In Path of Exile 2's endgame, you're gonna spend like 90 to 95% of your time clearing maps, so this is the main skill of the build. As far as I've been able to figure out, every single rare and every single map has easily been destroyed by this. A lot of the time they either just get one shot or two shot by it. Very extremely tanky mobs with really bad mods and like 5 or 6 modifiers on them can maybe take 10 or 15 seconds at most, but mapping has been an absolute dream. Now let's talk a little bit about single target. So I am using a weapon swap with 2 crossbows, and this brings up a slight peculiarity of the way that GGG has set up the system. As you may or may not know, whenever you load a crossbolt, you are essentially just loading ammo into your crossbow. As you move between the different bolts, you'll notice that I'm loading different sets of ammo and it's taking some mana from me. However, if you assign different skills to different crossbows, they have a different crossbow shot skill. So you don't have to do this very frequently at all. It's basically only when you're walking up to a boss, but you will, when doing single target, have to swap to a different crossbow skill if you're using both crossbows. Now, as for the bossing setup, so we're using a couple abilities to make this happen. So the first is going to be Plasma Blast. This is basically like a big charge up shot that's going to do a ton of damage and shock things extremely hard. It's got 30% more chance to shock, 30% more shock duration. Now that in and of itself isn't going to be enough for bosses. However, when we use this Stormfire support, it says shocks from supported skills do not expire on ignited enemies. Now keep in mind, when I first saw this, I thought that that just meant the shock was going to be permanent and I didn't have to do anything. However, the enemy has to stay ignited. So to be able to do that, we're using Flame Wall. So Flame Wall is just an auto-ignite skill. As long as it's underneath the target, the enemy is ignited, and the ignite lasts past the duration of this as well. It is pretty simple to keep bosses ignited. You just toss a flame wall underneath them anytime that they move. This lasts about close to 7 seconds for me, which is more than enough to deal with most bosses casting this once or twice. So all that you have to do is you charge up your big plasma round as the boss is doing its wind up animation, hit it, put a flame wall underneath it, and then you're just gonna load shock burst rounds into it until it's dead. Pop up another flame wall whenever those start to expire. We also do have 2 additional abilities. If the boss is extremely durable, we do have a curse here with conductivity. It'll make it so the boss takes a decent amount extra damage, and then we also do have emergency reload. What this ability does is that when you're at the end of a clip, you can hit it to instantly refill your ammo, and also this emergency rounds is going to make the loaded bolts do even more damage. So 29% more damage here, and then an additional 15 because of the support. This makes it so that even on those like super buffed up bosses with a bunch of map boss difficulty on them, which they start to kind of feel like pinnacle bosses after a point when you get enough of this. When I didn't have any of these map boss difficulty nodes, I was able to just do glacial bolts and have no problem whatsoever. But as I started to scale this up, it got a lot harder. They become significantly tankier. I'm curious to see what happens when I get at least one more level to map boss difficulty. I'll probably go 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm curious to see how difficult these get when it moves up into the very high end stuff. But yeah, these points make bosses a lot more difficult. If you're struggling with bosses, I highly suggest you just take these points out because they really do make things more difficult. But these nodes are quite good. You get a lot of waystones, you get a lot of item drops from these bosses. Pretty good nodes. That's how all of our skills work. If you're interested in any of the support gems and stuff like that, it will always be down in the Mobalytics guide, so make sure to check that out. But let's talk a bit about gear. So before we even begin here, I do want to talk a little bit about Cloak of Flame, because one feedback I have right now about Path of Exile 2 in general is that armor just doesn't really feel great. And playing as a witch hunter, you are kind of incentivized to use armor. So the issue, if you're not aware with armor, is that the formula for armor, the way it works is that the harder that you get hit, the less effective armor is. So on these very large hits that happen sometimes, like either like a boss hits you very hard for physical damage, or some random mob is just really beefed up and hits you really hard for physical damage, armor does essentially nothing. So there's very few ways to deal with the fact that if something has a big physical damage hit, you're probably gonna die if you take like a giant slam or something like that. So something I did mess with is I did try out Cloak of Flame, taking 40% of physical damage, moving it over to fire damage. And the reason for this is because of this sorcery ward that you see up here. This is something from the Ascendancy that we've got here. It makes it so that elemental damage from hits is taken from the barrier that you've got before your life mana or energy shield, and it's equivalent to 30% of your armor and evasion. So the whole idea is that you want to stack as much armor and evasion as you can because it gives you this giant elemental damage shield, which helps quite a bit against elemental damage. And then if you end up using Cloak of Flame, 40% of that physical damage is taken as fire damage, meaning a large portion of the physical damage is blocked by this shield. However, there's a problem. The biggest piece of armor and evasion that you can get on your entire build is your chest piece, and this has no armor and evasion. So in my mind, you can run this either way. You can either just get a big life armor evasion chest piece, and that's honestly what I've been doing for most of my time here, because you can get additional stats, you can get life, you can get all these kinds of cool things. Or if you find that you're not really dying and you do think that maybe you want to be a little bit tankier against like big boss abilities and such, and you're not as good at dodging them, you can try out Cloak of Flame. Both of these work. I've played with both setups. I will mention it in the written guide as well about swapping between these two. But overall, I feel like the ceiling is going to be a bit higher on just a good rare chest piece with a lot of armor, a lot of evasion, and as much life and other stats as you can get. So now that I've kind of explained that, it's about the same for most of the rest of the gear. You're really trying to get as much armor, as much evasion, as much life, and enough resistances to cover all of your elemental resistances. Now I'm working towards getting more chaos res here after they recently nerfed how much fire, cold, and lightning you need, but it's still pretty hard to be able to get enough chaos res on pretty much any build at the moment. So life, armor and evasion, as much resistances as you can get up to the cap on all of them, and then any stats that help out your build. Stats are actually a pretty big thing in Path of Exile 2. You're going to need a decent amount of them, so don't skip out on pieces of gear that have a good amount of stats. They are very important. Now there is one peculiarity with armor evasion builds, in that you do want a straight flat armor pair of gloves. This is because of a node on the tree. If we come all the way down here, you'll see this node that says +1 to evasion rating per 1 armor on equipped gloves. So it makes sense to just go for a flat amount of armor on your gloves and get a whole bunch of evasion rating on top of that. We're using an armor belt just because armor is quite good for us. All of the rest of our gear is just like resistances, movement speed, evasion, armor, as much as we can get. When it comes to the crossbow, we are using a big physical crossbow. I am using 2 crossbows, and I'll talk about the weapon swap when we're talking about the passive tree. The one most important thing on your crossbow that I would say that you should pay attention to is gonna be this line here that says reload time. There's a couple crossbows that have very slow reload time. I think the worst offender is like the Diod crossbow. It's got like a base 1.1 second reload time. It feels really bad, so you should try to avoid that crossbow, avoid the Bombard crossbow because we're not using grenades at all. Try to focus on crossbows that have a good reload time. But beyond that, you're just gonna wanna get as much physical damage as you possibly can. Attack speed is good. Notably for this build, crit is bad because on our second weapon swap, we are using this lightning rod here. Lightning damage with non-critical hits is lucky, so you don't want crit on your weapon if you can help it. But like I said, my other weapon is more of the same. It's just physical damage, attack speed, and as good of a reload time as I can possibly get. Talking about charms, if you do happen to get access to more charms, I would highly suggest getting a chaos resistance charm. But for right now, I'm mainly using a freeze charm just because that's what's been killing me the most in maps, is that there's these like shade mobs that go invisible constantly, and they do this like long area attack that just freezes you instantly. It was really frustrating me, so I decided to just toss this on, and it's become a lot easier since then. As for our flasks, our life flask, you absolutely want a seething. Instant life recovery has always been extremely powerful in Path of Exile. It's no different in Path of Exile 2. Get as good of a suffix mod as you can, but that instant recovery there is super powerful. Definitely get an instant one. When it comes to your mana flask, there will be some circumstances on very difficult bosses where if your gear just isn't up to par, you haven't got like your combos and everything down properly, the bosses might take a decent amount of time. And one thing that can limit you is if you don't have enough mana to be able to cast your abilities. So getting that gains charges per second is super useful, especially on those long fights. Most of the time, if you have even a little bit of mana leech anywhere on your gear, you're not even going to need to click your mana flask. However, if you can't get any mana leech whatsoever, then you probably will be clicking this a decent amount, but it's not too awful. So that's gonna be it for our gear. Nothing crazy, no super like tier 0 expensive uniques or items or things like that. When it comes to sockets, you're going to want physical damage on your weapon. You're going to want either like percentage armor evasion on any pieces of your gear, or chaos resistance, or anything else that you need for your character. Now, talking about our ascendancy, we are the Witchhunter. I have somewhat mixed feelings about the Witchhunter, but I do think it's a pretty decent ascendancy. It's just most of the power of the Witchhunter is not obvious at first glance, because I think the strongest nodes on this build really are Witchbane and, to an extent, No Mercy. 30% more damage is just nice, but Witchbane is a very, very powerful effect. When you are fighting bosses, or when you are fighting like difficult rare mobs, this concentration mechanic, as you can see here, makes it so that enemies have less cooldown recovery rate. It means that they're going to be using their big abilities less frequently. So as you get all the way down to 0% concentration, it's going to be 50% less cooldown recovery rate, which means almost half as often are they going to be using their abilities. This is a lot more powerful than you might realize that it is. It means that you can spend more time DPSing, you can spend less time dodging abilities, and there's less chances for you to get randomly one-shot by those big, powerful boss abilities that might be killing you. Behind that node, we do have No Mercy. Deal up to 30% more damage to enemies based on their missing concentration. You're probably going to be doing at least a tiny bit of damage because of Flame Wall going at all times, so your concentration's never really going to go away unless the boss goes invulnerable, which, if it does, it is what it is, not much that you can do about it. And then the other two nodes here are going to be Sorcery Ward, as well as an increased effect of Sorcery Ward. Sorcery Ward is interesting. Originally, I wasn't using this ability, and there's still a few quirks here that I think they need to figure out. But as I said previously, this gives you a large elemental damage shield from specifically hits, based off of your armor and your evasion. However, the downside to this effect is that it does give you 50% less armor and evasion rating. So as for quality, I have tried to quality this gem in my page and it simply doesn't let me. I'm assuming that there's like gear or maybe points on the tree or something that allows you to quality this, but if you can find any way to be able to quality this, let me know down in the comments, because I haven't really figured out a way so far yet. It would help quite a bit for the build survivability. If it's very, very difficult to obtain that quality, probably not as good. You really do want some kind of extra source of just additional effective health pool. You can give up on this and take these points out and you'll have way more armor and way more evasion, but your actual total life pool is going to be tiny without this. I do want to mention, you can like just forego these points completely. It is possible. You can drop Ceremonial Ablution, you can drop Obsessive Rituals, and you can just take Pitiless Killer and Judge, Jury, and Executioner. That's perfectly fine. If you find that this is comfortable for you, you're good enough at dodging stuff, and you just want more damage, these two nodes are perfectly fine. However, for me, I kind of wanted some Sorcery Ward, a little bit better like defensive layer against some of those really super crazy bursts of damage that happen in high tier maps. Next thing to talk about is going to be the passive tree. Now I am using weapon sets here, and I am using 2 separate crossbows. The main reason for this is that there are nodes that scale like the clear of Glacial Bolt, and there are nodes that scale the damage of Stormburst rounds. And they're pretty different things. Like for Glacial Bolt, we're wanting to scale this AoE here, we're wanting to scale this AoE here, because it lends towards those giant AoE overlaps and explosions that you can see happening here. Whereas with Shockburst rounds, we really do want some of this lightning damage. Like lightning damage with non-critical hits as Lucky is super powerful. Lucky means that things are rolled twice and then it uses the best of the 2 rolls. Super powerful mechanic. And we get some like lightning penetration and some more shock chance and all kinds of good things like that. Elemental ailments causes more damage. Just a bunch of nodes that help us with that single target damage on bosses, because we're not really going to be caring about AoE during that time. As for the overall tree itself, it's pretty standard for an armor evasion based crossbow build. We're taking projectile damage, we're taking armor and evasion nodes, we're taking two-handed damage because we are a crossbow, it's two-hander. Getting enough accuracy where it shows, at least in your like little page here, that you've got 100% chance to hit within 2 meters. Notably in this game, it seems the further away that enemies are, the less your accuracy is. And then beyond all the damage and such, we're going to be taking some utility nodes. This makes it so that we have a chance to blind, which is going to make it so that, you know, enemies hit us less frequently. Very powerful effect. And then we're also, of course, going to be taking these maim nodes up here. This maim makes it so that enemies are slower and they have reduced evasion, which means it's easier for us to hit them. And then beyond that, I do want to mention real quick about attack speed and skill speed. Attack speed and skill speed do affect crossbow reload time, which is powerful. However, in general, I think that you want to take enough skill speed and enough attack speed on your build so that it feels comfortable to play. Any more than that is not necessarily going to be significantly better for your clear. It is more damage because of shock burst rounds. Shock burst rounds do more damage if you attack faster with them, of course, but when it comes to Glacial Bolt and to fragmentation rounds, it really only matters up to the point where you're comfortable. A last note about the tree, when it comes to jewels, we're really looking for just as much damage as we can realistically get. I'm not using any of the crazy unique jewels that, give you a bunch of extra effectiveness of stats. A lot of those are super expensive right now. I'll probably add them into the guide as like an option for people who want to spend more money. However, you're really just looking for like damage and any good defensive mods that you can possibly get, like maximum resistances is okay, increased elemental ailment threshold is okay, but you're really just looking for like damage, magnitude of ailments, and that's about it. Jewels don't have a ton of crazy good nodes on them realistically. They're just kind of like a little bonus to damage is what it feels like. One last thing that I did forget about the tree, it does seem like attributes are a lot harder to come by in Path of Exile 2. If you're struggling with attributes, you can take some points out of damage, like these kinds of nodes, or say these nodes down here, like the rare and unique nodes, and come down here and take some more of these attribute nodes to be able to fill out the rest of your items and fill out the rest of your skills. When it comes to mapping and content that this build is good at, in general, I would say that this is a mapping build. Mechanics like ritual, mechanics like breach are going to be things that this build is good at. Things with lots of density, lots of enemies, because it makes it so that you can get that really satisfying clear through a whole bunch of enemies. But most things on the map are doable. Most things on the Atlas are doable. I haven't really had too many issues anywhere. One thing I would say to be careful about with your maps is keep an eye on very specific modifiers. A few that are kind of difficult are monsters have increased ailment threshold. This makes it significantly harder to freeze enemies, which is going to make it harder to get those large chains. It's also going to make it more difficult to get that shock on a boss at the end of the map. This can be a problem, so do be careful about that. And then beyond that, you're also going to want to be careful about maps that just generically increase all damage by a large amount. So a map like this that increases monster damage and gives them crit is going to make it so that monsters that do physical damage are getting a huge boost. If you're not using this Cloak of Flame setup, you might run into situations where you just get hit by a really large physical hit, especially on a boss that just does too much damage and it overwhelms you. So just be aware of that as you're moving up into the higher tier maps. This really is only a problem in very super high tier maps with like boss levels added onto them through the Atlas points here. If you're just in the campaign or you're just in early mapping, you're not really going to run into any of these kinds of problems. However, at the very super high end, before your gear is very good, lots of just generic damage modifiers can be a little scary, so watch out for those. And that's going to be it for the video. Any updates to things about the build are either going to be over on my Small Ducks channel if I'm doing like just generic updates, but this is probably where the build is landing. I'm most likely going to be moving on to another build relatively soon. I'll do a little bit more work for a couple more days here, but for the most part, I think this is about where it's going to land. As always, any build updates will always be down in the description at the Mobalytics link. Check there because it will be the most up-to-date location for this build and any other builds that I create. If you like this video, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in raid class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.